It began with the sound of snuffling in the pale dawn, a wet rustle among the potato leaves. The mist still clung low over the fields, and the tide whispered against the dark kelp-slick stones below. On San Juan Island, mornings were slow, things grey as ash, damp as breath, the world waking in whispers rather than shouts. But this morning carried the quiet violence of fate, and it walked on the short legs of a black boar. The pig's hunger led it between neat rows of green, rooting in the earth with a joyless persistence. The settler who owned those potatoes watched from his window, his jaw tightening as if the intruder were a thief in his own bedchamber. He was an American, a man who had bent his life into this soil, staking his future on land that was, in the eyes of law and empire, neither fully his nor anyone's. The pig was no wild creature. It belonged to a neighbouring Irishman in the employ of the British Hudson's Bay Company, whose red-coated presence loomed over these waters from the garrison at Vancouver Island. The settler stepped out, rifle in hand. Perhaps he called a warning, perhaps he did not. The boar only nosed deeper, digging up the pale bulbs like treasure. One sharp report cracked across the meadow, startling the gulls into the fog. The pig collapsed, a dark smear against the dew-wet earth. And with that, a single bullet had torn open the fault line between two empires. For years, the San Juan Islands had been a shadowed place on the maps, claimed by both Britain and the United States, yet governed by neither. Farmers from the south planted orchards. Traders from the north drove cattle through the tall grass. The strait shimmered between them, but under that water ran a current of suspicion and pride. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 had drawn the boundary along the parallel, yet its language left a gap, an uncertainty in the threading of the map. San Juan lay in that gap, a quiet pawn on a board watched by two great powers. Word of the shooting spread faster than the tide. The Irishman demanded payment for his pig. The settler refused, spitting that the beast had trespassed. Neighbors took sides, and then, across the Sound, the story reached American military ears. A captain was dispatched, George Pickett, a man whose posture was as rigid as the saber at his side. He arrived with a detachment of men and a battery of cannon, planting them on the bluff above the harbour as if expecting the very sea to rise against him. From the British side came in answer 3 warships, their black hulls cutting the grey. Water guns yawning like patient predators. They anchored within range, their flags snapping in the salt wind. The island, so small that one could walk its length in a day, now held the stillness of a battlefield before the first volley. Men stood at their posts with muskets cradled, eyes never leaving the fog beyond the shoreline. Weeks passed in that tense, suspended world. The pigs and cattle grazed as they always had. Children fetched water from the wells, glancing nervously at the cannons that pointed toward the horizon. The officers dined, parleyed, drank tea under white canvas, all the while measuring one another in the long silences between words. Any spark could have set the meadow aflame, but no such spark came. Behind the rigid salutes and diplomatic smiles, cooler heads worked to weave a thread between honor and peace. Messages crossed the water in small boats, each word weighed as carefully as gold. Washington and London were far away. Their orders moved at the pace of wind and tide, and so, here at the edge of the world, decisions were made in whispers over charts, in the creak of wooden decks under starlight. Finally, an agreement was reached, not a surrender, not a victory, but a truce. The island would be jointly occupied. American and British soldiers living side by side, their camps separated by a stretch of green and an unspoken rule of respect. For 12 years, they kept that uneasy peace. 2 flags rose above the island's hills, and beneath them life continued: births, harvests, storms, and the slow erosion of anger. The pig was never buried with ceremony. No monument marked the spot where it fell. In time, the men who had come, bristling with arms, grew older, their tempers worn smooth by weather and routine. The great powers found other arenas for their rivalry, and when, at last, the matter of the boundary was sent to arbitration in far-off Europe, it was the United States that was awarded the island. The British departed quietly, their ships slipping away into the mists as if they had never been, yet the story endured. Islanders told it by firelight, with a rueful shake of the head, how one man's rifle shot had nearly summoned the thunder of war, how 2 nations had stared each other down over the body of a hog. It became a lesson and a jest, a reminder that pride is a more dangerous animal than any that walks on 4 legs. Even now, when the fog rolls in heavy over the strait, it is easy to imagine those warships lying in the white haze, their lanterns burning like distant stars. Easy to hear the faint echo of boots on the bluff, the metallic sigh of a cannon being turned toward the horizon, and somewhere in that imagined quiet, the soft grunt of a pig rooting in forbidden earth, unaware of the history that would grow from its hunger. In the end, no shots were fired beyond that first one. No blood was spilled, save for the small life taken in a field of potatoes. But the truth is more complicated than the jest. For war is not only measured in bodies and broken cities, it is also measured in the inches between pride and restraint, in the breath held before a trigger is pulled, in the silent agreements that keep the world from tipping into ruin. The pig war, they called it, as if to laugh it away. Yet the name hides the deeper thing, that an empire can be drawn to the edge of the sword by the smallest of provocations, and that peace is not always born of reason, but of the quiet, stubborn refusal to let pride have the final word. Somewhere in the long ledger of history, there is an empty page where the battle might have been written, a space between dates where death was expected but never came. It is a space carved not by victory, but by the rare grace of holding one's fire. And perhaps that, more than the pig or the patch of potatoes, is what makes the tale worth telling. The island remains, green and windswept, the fields tilled, the tide whispering at its stones. Visitors walk the old earthworks, stand where cannons once faced the sea, and feel the quiet there. They may smile at the absurdity of it all, but if they linger long enough, they will hear in the wind what the island remembers, that even the smallest bones can cast the longest shadows, and that sometimes it is in choosing not to fight that the truest victories are won. They came with the dawn, shadows moving through the pale gold of a thirsty land. At first there was no sound but the rustle of dry grass and the low hum of wind across the flat horizon. Then there they were, hundreds of dark bodies striding out of the desert, long necks raised, black feathers catching the thin light. Emus, great, ancient birds that could run like the wind but never fly, moving in an endless ripple over the earth like a tide given legs. It was the spring of 1932, and Western Australia was a country within a country, vast, red and brittle under the weight of drought. The Great Depression had bitten deep into the land. The banks were cold and merciless, the skies empty of rain. Wheat fields that had once whispered with life now stood brittle as paper, each stalk a fragile hope. Farmers had sown the seed in faith, But the desert had other plans. Hunger drove the emus from the inland scrub toward the coast, and there, among the ragged rows of grain, they found plenty. They came in battalions, 200, 300 at a time, pouring through the wire fences as though they were made of mist. They trampled what they could not eat, their strong legs cutting paths through the crops. To the farmers, each footstep was the sound of ruin. There was no money left to repair the damage. The wheat had been meant to feed families, to pay debts, to hold back the encroaching poverty. And now 1,000 beady eyes regarded them without fear. The farmers turned to the government, and the government turned to the army. The request was strange, almost shameful. Could the military be sent, not against a foreign enemy, but against the feathered hordes? The answer was yes, and so trucks rattled into the wheat fields, carrying soldiers armed with Lewis guns belt-fed, water-cooled weapons of the great war gleaming absurdly beneath the relentless sun. The first engagement began in early November. The soldiers took position, setting their sights on a cluster of birds grazing along the edge of a field. A nod, a pull of the trigger, and the rattle of gunfire shattered the morning stillness. Dust leaped, feathers flew, but the emus scattered before the lead could claim many of them. They ran in long darting lines, their strides devouring the ground, disappearing into the distance with a grace that mocked the clumsy metal beasts that pursued them again and again. The soldiers tried. They ambushed the birds at waterholes, only to find their quarry had vanished before the first shot. They mounted the Lewis gun on the back of a truck and gave chase. But the rough earth bucked and jolted the aim until bullets tore harmlessly into the dust. The emus seemed to sense the reach of the weapons, keeping always just beyond it, regrouping when the soldiers withdrew. Days turned to weeks, and the absurdity of the war deepened. The soldiers had been sent with the confidence of men trained to fight other men. They had faced artillery and trenches, yet here they found themselves outmaneuvered by creatures with no strategy, no commander, no map, only instinct and speed. The farmers watched in despair as the birds returned to their fields, each one a dark, implacable shadow among the wheat. There were small victories, bursts of feathers, a handful of bodies left behind, but these moments were rare. For every bird felled, dozens more melted into the scrub. The soldiers spoke of the emus as if they were ghosts, impossible to corner, impossible to kill in numbers that mattered. It was said, half in jest and half in resignation, that the birds could take a bullet and keep running, their great muscles carrying them far from the field where they had fallen. The war bled resources, ammunition spent, time lost, tempers frayed. Each dawn brought the same sight, the endless horizon, the wheat swaying faintly in the dry wind, and the dark, bobbing shapes of emus moving somewhere just out of reach. Pride began to crack under the weight of futility. By December, the government recalled the troops. The soldiers withdrew with no victory to parade, no trophies to display. The emus remained in the fields, their numbers scarcely diminished, their slow march continuing as though the interruption had been nothing more than a brief summer storm. The farmers were left to mend their fences, to salvage what they could, to carry the quiet bitterness of having called for war and found defeat in the unlikeliest of enemies. The land remembers, even now when the wind moves low across the wheat fields. Of Western Australia, it carries an echo of that strange campaign, the clatter of old guns, the shouts of men over the thrum of running feet, the quick flash of dark feathers vanishing into the horizon. It was a war without medals, without surrender, a war where the victors never knew they had won. In the end, the emus did not conquer in the way of human armies. They took no ground and raised no banners. They simply endured, surviving because they were too many, too swift, too wild for the lines and tactics of men. And perhaps that is the deeper truth the land keeps in its silence, that some battles cannot be measured in strength or skill, but in the quiet resilience of those who will not be moved. The soldiers went home, the farmers fought on, alone, and in the endless ledger of history, the march of the emus stands as both jest and parabola, reminder that pride can be humbled by the smallest of foes, and that war, once called into being, has no obligation to honor our intentions. The wheat grows again each season, but somewhere in its whispering, the shadow of that absurd, solemn struggle still moves, tall, dark, and unafraid, under the low, bruised sky of late autumn. The bells of Bologna tolled not for the dead, but for the insult. Somewhere, in the shadowed streets near the heart of the city, a well stood silent, its rope swinging in the breath of evening, and at its side, emptiness. The bucket was gone, a wooden vessel, weathered by years of drawing water for thirsty citizens, had been taken in the night. To strangers it would be no more than a relic of daily life, a thing too ordinary to deserve a whisper. But in the breathless alleys and the echoing courtyards of Bologna, the theft was a wounded deliberate cut in the flesh of civic pride. For years, Bologna had been a city pressed between two grinding stones, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. These were not mere parties, but worlds apart, bound by ancient loyalties and festering resentments. To the Guelphs of Bologna, the Ghibellines of Modena were not neighbors. They were a shadow always at the gate, an old enemy who smiled with teeth. And to the Ghibellines, the Guelphs were self-righteous and swollen with arrogance. Theirs was a feud so old that its beginning was already half forgotten, like a scar whose cause no one recalls, yet whose ache remains. So when the bucket was stolen from the well, and rumour whispered that it had been carried off to Modena as a trophy, it was not merely a petty theft. It was a challenger's sneer painted in broad daylight. The fields between the two cities were already thirsty that year, the rivers running low under a sun that seemed to bake the soil itself into stone. But thirst was nothing compared to the heat rising now in the blood of men. Bologna's council gathered in the hall of red brick, its great timber-bird ceiling echoing with words sharpened like daggers. There would be no letter sent, no quiet demand for return. To them, this was not about the bucket, it was about honor, about the long years of humiliation, skirmishes, and whispered insults. The Guelph banners were brought out, stitched with lions that seemed to leap in the candlelight. In Modena, news of Bologna's rage brought laughter to the halls. The bucket already hung high in their own city as a symbol of the theft was polished and displayed. Men stood beneath it with wine in hand, boasting that a Guelph's outrage was sweeter than any vintage. But behind their mirth, they too sharpened swords and mended shields, for though they mocked, they knew Bologna would march. And march they did. 2,000 men, a river of steel and leather, their helmets catching what little sun the clouds allowed. Horses snorted in the cold, their breath misting like smoke from a hidden fire. Along the road to Modena they went, their footfalls heavy with the weight of vengeance. Modena was ready. On the fields outside the city walls, beneath a sky that seemed too wide and too silent for what was to come, the two forces faced each other. There was no grand emperor watching, no crown to claim, no borders to read drawnly to proud city-states staring across a strip of earth, each unwilling to Bend. The first clash rang out like a hammer striking an anvil. The air filled with the smell of churned mud, sweat, and iron. Shields groaned beneath the weight of blows. Arrows hissed like serpents through the grey light. The ground was torn by boots and hooves, and in places it grew slick with blood that steamed in the cold. For hours the fight surged and swayed, the tide of men pushing forward, falling back, charging again. The bucket itself, hanging far from the field, did nothing but wait mute, and wooden wild men killed each other in its name. When the dust finally began to settle, it was Modena's banner that still flew above the trampled field. Their lines held, and Bologna's men, battered and bleeding, began the long retreat. Modena did not chase them far, for their victory was already certain. The bucket remained in their possession. The insult remained unanswered. But victory, if it could be called that, was hollow. The dead lay silent in the churned earth, and the living limped home with eyes that stared at nothing. In Bologna, the empty well still stood, its ropes swaying in the same cold wind, the water below untouched. And though life in the city resumed, bread was baked. Merchants called from their stalls. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the city itself carried the shame like a stone in its chest. Years passed. The bucket became legend in Modena, hung high in the Tor della Ghirlandina, so that every passer-by might look upon it and remember. In Bologna, its absence became a quiet ghost, a reminder of how pride can bleed a city. The war, brief as it had been, left behind no heroes, no songs, only graves and an unanswered question. What had truly been fought for? It is easy to say it was a war for a bucket, but that is too simple and perhaps too cruel. In truth, the bucket was only a spark falling on a forest already dry with old grievances. A single insult can ignite what years of reason cannot quench. Men will tell you wars are fought for honor, for faith, for freedom, but more often they are fought for the weight of a memory that no one wants to release. And so the bucket still hangs in Modena to this day, a piece of wood that has outlived the men who killed for it. It creaks faintly in the wind, and its shadow falls long in the evening light. Perhaps, if you stand before it and listen closely, you will hear not the pride of a city, but the whisper of those who lay down in the soil for something they could not drink from, could not eat, could not love something that mattered only because they were told it must. In the end, the war for the bucket was not about the bucket at all. It was about the stubborn, unyielding part of the human heart that would rather spill blood than let go of an insult. And in that way, it is not so different from the wars that came before, and the wars that will come again. For pride is a well from which we draw until it runs dry, and by the time we look down to see the bottom, it is too late to pull the rope back up. Under a pale, reluctant sun, the petric borderlands lay still, as if holding their breath. The autumn wind slid low over the grass, dry and smelling faintly of smoke from distant hearths. It was the kind of day that should have passed unnoticed, a forgettable leaf in the long calendar of nations. But history does not choose its moments for grandeur. Sometimes it chooses the absurd. Sometimes it chooses a dog no one remembers from which side the animal came, whether its paws first pressed Greek earth or Bulgarian soil. It had no allegiance, no map in its mind. It wandered where scent led it, where wind carried promise. And in the grey hours before the shooting, it crossed the thin, fragile line men had drawn to keep themselves apart. To the dog, the border was invisible. To the soldiers, it was sacred. A bark, sharp against the wind, a chase through brittle grass. The Greek sentry raised his rifle not with malice, but with the reflex born of too many months in a place where trespass meant threat. The shot cracked the afternoon wide open. The dog fell, its breath spilling into the dust. Eyes fixed on a sky too wide to care. That single report echoed across hills like a curse. On the Bulgarian side, there was movement, men peering toward the sound, hands tightening on weapons. Pride flared hotter than reason. In the barracks, word spread quickly. The Greeks had fired. Whether it man or beast no longer mattered. The insult was enough. By nightfall, boots were already moving. Bulgarian troops edged across the contested land, the quiet air breaking under the dull thunder of marching feet. They came not with banners of conquest, but with the low, smouldering intent of retribution. The Greeks met them with rifles raised, and the land between them fields, that once only bore the weight of sheep and shepherds, suddenly shuddered under the violence of men in the black hours before dawn. Gunfire flashed like lightning trapped at ground level. No battle plan, no maps marked with careful inconly bursts of rage and the instinct to answer fire with fire. Somewhere in the chaos, shouts in Greek tangled with curses in Bulgarian, and the wounded were carried back through mud slick with both rain and blood. No one could name the first man to fall. The earth took them all the same villages. Near the border shuddered themselves. Mothers kept children close, ears straining for the distant percussion of rifles. In low-lit rooms, old men muttered that it had begun again, another war born of pride and a thin red line on a foreigner's chart. But this one was stranger, pettier, as if the gods themselves were mocking the seriousness of mortal wars. For 2 days, the skirmish swelled like a wound. Shots rang from hill to hill. Small patrols vanished into the folds of the land and did not return. And the autumn wind kept sweeping over the fields, as if to erase the footprints of the living and the dead alike. Telegrams flew faster than bullets. Now, streaking toward Athens, Sofia, and further still to Geneva, where the League of Nations stirred uneasily. By the 3rd day, the diplomats had caught the scent of blood. They spoke in marble rooms far from the cold earth where men lay stiffening, their voices wrapped in civility but sharp with urgency. In the streets of Europe's capitals, the newspapers found a name for it, the war of the stray dog. The name itself seemed to trivialize the dead, to make light of the broken bodies lying under coarse blankets. Yet it spread, and the world watched in bafflement as 2 nations bled over an animal that could not speak its own cause. The League's emissaries came like rain after a firecool, insistent, determined to smother what flames remained. They brought words instead of rifles, and their language was heavy with the need to end this quickly. In the end, Bulgaria was ordered to pay compensation. The border was to be respected. And the soldiers, those who still lived, were told to lay down arms. Orders came down the line, and the guns went quiet, as if the war had been nothing more than a fevered dream. The field where the dog fell returned to silence. Grass grew over the spots where blood had darkened the soil. The animal was never buried, with ceremony, never given a name in the records. Its body disappeared into the earth, leaving only the faintest of whispers in the wind. Yet for those who fought and bled, the dog became more than an accident. It was the spark, the insult, the excuse. And perhaps that was the strangest thing of all, how quickly an unthinking creature became the center of human fury. Years later, old men who had been young then would tell the story in the smoke-filled corners of cafes. They would speak of the day when the border shook, when boots marched for the honor of a land, and how it all began with a single shot at a nameless dog. Some laughed at the absurdity, Others shook their heads and said nothing, staring into the dark surface of their coffee as if it held the answer. History records the war as short, the casualties as modest by the cruel arithmetic of the 20th century. Yet those numbers cannot hold the truth. They cannot show the way the cold air clung to the lungs of men lying wounded in the grass. They cannot measure the hollowness of a mother's house when her son does not return. They cannot weigh the silence that followed the last shot. Borders are lines drawn by hands that will one day be dust. But in the hours when pride swells and anger runs hotter than the blood it spills, those lines become walls, and walls become battlefields. The war of the stray dog was not fought for land worth dying over, nor for riches, nor for the salvation of a people. It was fought because men could not stand to be crossed not by another army, not even by a creature that did not know its trespass. The wind still moves over the hills of Petrick, still carries the smell of grass, the rustle of leaves. And somewhere in that wind, if you stand quietly enough, you might hear it, the faint, uncertain echo of paws on the earth, and the long-ago breath before a shot split the day in two, a reminder that even the smallest step across a fragile line can summon the full weight of war. It began with the sound of coins clinking in an empty jar. Not a war drum, not the rattle of rifles, just the hollow, metallic gasp of a dream being measured and found wanting. In the spring of 1947, British Columbia's air was clean with salt and pine, but the streets of its towns whispered with a new kind of hunger. The war had ended 2 years before, and peace was still fresh enough to taste in the morning wind. Bread was plentiful, trains ran again, and radios hummed in living rooms with news of rebuilding far-off lands. But in Ladysmith, small town by the sea, the children discovered a darker truth. The chocolate bars in the glass case of the corner store had risen from 5 cents to 8. It was not the kind of thing adults would march for, not the kind of thing that history books wrote about. Yet for the children, whose pockets were a kingdom of small silver and copper, that price rise was not merely arithmetic. It was an act of theft. It was the silent tearing of a page from the gospel of their innocence. The store itself sat on the corner of High Street, a squat building with a striped awning that bleached in the sun. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of licorice and peppermint. Through the clear glass jars and neat stacks of Cadbury, Nielsen, and Rontrees, the children could see the forbidden gold smooth, wrapped, and now priced out of reach. One child, no more than 11, slammed his palm on the counter that morning, his coins rattling in his fist. "It's not fair," he said, voice cracking, though the shopkeeper only smiled sadly, shrugging as if he too were helpless against the tide. Another, older boy stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching the younger ones fume. And then, without warning, a plan began to form, not from the minds of their elders, but from the quiet fury that grows in small hearts when the world tilts unjustly by noon. Word had spread like spilled sugar across the town. Schoolyards hummed with it, lunch pails forgotten, homework abandoned. They would march together, for their bars, for their nickels, for their right to sweetness in a world that had already taken enough from them. The first march began with perhaps 50 children. They spilled from the school gates like a tide of wool caps and scuffed boots, banners scrawled in pencil on torn cardboard. "We want 5 cents. Chocolate is our right." Some had painted their slogans in red ink that ran in the damp spring air, staining their fingers like blood. Drums were replaced by the steady rhythm of sneakers and shoes striking the cobblestones. Their chants rose into the gullest sky, high voices breaking into fierce unison. 5 cents, 5 cents. Shopkeepers leaned out of doorways to watch. Mothers called from porches, torn between pride and worry. By the time they reached Victoria's legislature, the 50 had become hundreds. Newspapers later called it a swarm, though to those who saw it, it was a river flowing fast, clear, unstoppable. They filled the square, their banners flapping in the sea wind, their eyes bright with the kind of courage only the very young possess. Inside the grand stone building, men in suits watched from tall windows, faces half hidden by the glint of glass. Some laughed softly, as if at a quaint amusement. Others frowned, feeling perhaps the same unease that had prickled the skin of kings when the peasants gathered too close to palace gates. The march did not end there. It rippled eastward Ladysmith to Nanaimo, then across ferries and along rails, to Vancouver, to Toronto, to Ottawa. Bloor Street saw the strangest parade in its memory. Children linking arms across intersections, stopping traffic with the force of their numbers. Even in the capital, the sound of their chants rose between the stone facades and under the Parliament's shadow. But where the children saw only their battle for chocolate, others saw opportunity. Leaflets appeared, printed by unseen hands, warning of corporate greed, demanding justice for workers and consumers alike. Names whispered in smoky rooms: agitators, communists, those who believed the smallest protest could be woven into a greater tapestry of unrest. For some politicians, the spectacle became more than a novelty, it was a stage. And these children were the actors they could use. Rumors spread like wildfire through radio waves and folded broadsheets. Was this truly about chocolate, or was it the beginning of something larger, something that could crack the shell of post-war complacency? Yet the children, those who started it, all knew only their simple truth. They were not puppets or players in shadowy games. They were a chorus of small defiance, holding up their nickels like coins of the realm, demanding the kingdom return. What was theirs? For days the marches continued, and the air between towns was thick with the sound of youthful rebellion. But rebellion, like chocolate, melts in the warmth of the world. It began to fade when the parents stepped in not as allies, but as weary guardians. They had endured years of ration books and telegrams, of fathers gone and never returned, of mothers working late into the night to stitch the nation whole again. To them, the cost of chocolate was not worth the shadow of trouble it drew. "It's only 3 cents," they said. The war took so much more. Children were pulled from the lines, hands guided home, the banners sagged, the chants thinned into silence. In Victoria, the square emptied. In Ottawa, the last voices drifted away like echoes into the dusk. The companies did not lower their prices. The bars stayed at 8 cents, gleaming in their wrappers as if nothing had happened. The march was declared over, and yet something lingered. In the quiet of their rooms, some children traced the folds of their old banners with fingertips, the cardboard soft now from rain and handling. Others stared at the chocolate in the shop windows, not with hunger, but with the sharp ache of remembering the day when they had tried to change the world. History did not mark their names in marble. The photographs that survive show only a blur. Of caps and coats, the shadows of banners in a pale sky. The newspapers kept their columns short, giving the story a few inches between the weightier matters of government and foreign war. But for those who had marched, it was a myth they carried. Inside them, they had stood in the open air with voices lifted, not as children, but as citizens. They had learned the bitter taste of defeat, and perhaps also the sweetness of standing together. Even if the prize slipped from their grasp. Years later, Some would tell their children about it not as a lesson, but as a story half wrapped in wonder. A time when the streets of British Columbia and Toronto and Ottawa rang with the voices of the smallest among them, when banners bobbed like sails in the sea wind, when the price of a chocolate bar was worth a fight, and in the telling, perhaps the rebellion grew larger than it was. The chants louder, the marches longer, the stakes higher. Myths, after all, have a way of rising like yeast in the warmth of memory. No one remembers the name of the boy who first clenched his fist in that corner shop. No one knows what became of the girl whose red ink bled into the spring rain. But their footsteps are still there, faint, beneath the asphalt and the years. If you listen in the stillness, on certain afternoons when the wind smells of salt and sugar, you might hear it, the rhythm of small shoes on stone, the echo of 100 voices crying for something more than sweetness, not just for chocolate, for fairness, for a world that kept its promises, and for the brief, shining moment when they believed such a world could be theirs. It began, as so many strange transformations do, with the sound of absence, not the thunder of cannon, nor the roar of an advancing army, but a quieter, more insidious emptiness, the ships that did not come, the markets that stood bare, the whisper of promises that would not be kept. In the first years of the 1800s, Turin lay beneath Napoleon's shadow, its streets alive with merchants, tailors, and chatter. Yet somewhere behind the perfume of bread and roasted chestnuts lingered a troubling scent, emptiness where cacao had once been. Napoleon's continental system was meant to strangle Britain, to choke her commerce, to starve her people of the trade that fed their strength. But blockades are not patient creatures. They gnaw at all who dwell within their reach. And so, though it was meant for others, the decree crept into the kitchens of Turin's chocolatiers, leaving their brass pots and marble slabs cold and idle. Ships bearing the dark, bitter beans from the Americas could not pass. Their cargo lay rotting in distant ports. In the cafes, murmurs began. Could chocolate itself vanish? The hills beyond the city watched in silence. There, the Piedmont countryside swelled with orchards of hazelnut trees, their shells burnished and fragrant. They had been here long before the crisis, humble harvests for farmers and bakers, but now they seemed to offer a kind of mute invitation. The master chocolatiersmen in white aprons with sleeves rolled high-gathered in dim workshops, their breath clouding in the cold air. What they decided was neither rebellion nor surrender, but something stranger, to marry what little cacao they had left with the abundant nuts of their own land. The stones of Turin's grinders groaned, the pestles bruised hazelnuts into fine, golden powder. Cocoa, precious as gold dust, was folded into the nut oil until a paste was born softer than chocolate, silkier and carrying a warmth of earth and orchard. The first taste was a revelation. It was not what they had lost, but it was something the blockade had never meant to give. And so Gianduja emerged, first wrapped in thin sheets, later shaped into the beloved domes of Giandujo, each a small declaration of resilience. Cafes lit by dim chandeliers began serving cups of this new creation, and patrons sipped slowly, as though guarding each mouthful from the reach of history. The blockade raged on. Napoleon's armies marched, but here, in the heart of Piedmont, there was sweetness. The war could not touch it. Some say the innovation was slow, a patient evolution rather than a single inspired moment. Others claim the blockade lit the fire in an instant, forcing hands and minds to move before the last cocoa bean was gone. But truth is slippery in such stories. It wears the perfume of memory more than the rigor of fact, and yet how fitting, that no general's strategy, no monarch's decree, could erase what these kitchens had conjured, while cannons blackened the horizon. Turin's shop windows glowed with the bronze sheen of hazelnut chocolate, like treasure hidden in plain sight. Lovers strolled the arcades with wrapped parcels in hand. Children pressed noses to glass, and somewhere a chocolatier leaned against his doorway, breathing in the faint warm air of roasted nuts. The blockade would end, as all sieges do, leaving behind its scars and its survivors. Cacao would flow again into the city, dark and bitter as before. And yet the people did not abandon their wartime invention. They had tasted something born from constraint, something that carried the memory of leaner days, but also the quiet triumph of creation in the face of deprivation. Now, more than 2 centuries later, John Dujas still melts upon the tongue, its sweetness tangled with an echo of that time when war closed every door but one. It asks, without speaking, can desperation be sweeter than victory? Perhaps the answer is hidden in its texture, in that union of what was scarce and what was near at hand. The taste is soft, but it lingers, carrying the scent of Piedmont hills, the shadow of blockaded ports, and the gentle defiance of those who refused to let even an emperor take away their sweetness. Beneath the high, thin air of the Valley of Mexico, where the lakes shone like mirrors of jade and the snow peaks of distant mountains gleamed under the sun, the warriors of the Mexica gathered. They came not for plunder, nor for the taking of cities, nor for the shattering of empires. They came for flowers, not the soft kind that wilt in the hand, but flowers of another nature living hearts, warm and pulsing, cut free and lifted toward the sky in offering. To the Aztec mind, such blooms were the food of the sun itself, payment for the fiery wheel that rolled each day across the heavens. Without them, the dawn would falter. Without them, night might never end. The ground was hard and cracked beneath their sandals. The air smelled of lake reeds and smoke from the temples. Feathers, shimmering with turquoise and gold, shook faintly in the wind as warriors stood waiting. This was not a campaign of chaos, but a ballet in armor. Numbers were matched. Weapons were chosen on each side. The lines stood equal. For in the flower Warwickshire victory was measured not by death, but by capture. The living prisoner was the prize. Some say the tradition began as an agreement between rival cities, Tenochtitlan, Tlaxcala, Huexotzinco, Cholula. They were enemies, yet bound by a shared devotion to the gods. In these staged encounters, each city could test its young warriors in the crucible of fear and honor. Each could gather the captives needed to nourish the temples. The gods' thirst was constant, and so, beneath the hot sun, they met again and again, knowing that in the morning they might be captors, and by dusk they might be bound, walking toward the obsidian knives themselves. It was said that when the first drumbeat sounded, a hush fell over the assembled armies, as if even the wind held its breath. Then the conch shells blew, their deep cry rolling out over the flat plain, and the warriors surged forward. The earth trembled with the pounding of feet, spears rattled, shields clashed. Theirs was not the frenzy of slaughter. Each man sought a single prize, a grip upon the arm of an opponent, a sudden wrench to unbalance, a swift knot of cords around the elbows. To kill was to waste the bloom. To take a life was to rob the sun of its sustenance. And so they fought with cunning, weaving in and out like dancers, bright cloaks swirling, obsidian-edged swords slicing the air, but stopping short of the fatal blow. Some wore cloaks of lilies, white as bone, the petals soon mottled with the splashes of red that would feed the temple fires. Others adorned themselves with marigolds, their gold heads bobbing in time with the rhythm of combat, a promise to the sun of what was to come. And when a man was seized when his wrists were bound and he was pulled from the press of bodies, the victor would lift his face toward the heavens and cry out the name of Huitzilopochtli, the sun god and the hummingbird of the south. That cry, sharp and piercing, rose over the field and was answered by the low, steady roll of the drums from the city's heart. Prisoners were not mocked, they were not beaten on the field, for in the strange order of this ritual war they were honored. They had fought well, and their fate was to ascend not to glory of life, but to the glory of sacrifice. They would be adorned, feasted, spoken to as brothers. And when the day came, they would mount the steps of the great temple, hearts steady, eyes fixed on the sky, knowing they were the chosen blooms in the bouquet of war. The people called these wars Exayuiatl flower wars, not for their gentleness, but for their beauty. The captured heart was the flower, the blood was the dew, the body was the stem cut clean, and each offering was a petal in the endless garland stretched between earth and sun. But beauty is never without its shadows. Not all saw the wars as noble. Among the enemies of Tenochtitlan, whispers stirred that the flower wars were but a cloak for true conquest, a way to weaken rivals while pretending to honor the gods. The Tlaxcalans, beset again and again, wondered if they were partners in ritual or prey in an endless hunt. Even among the Mexica themselves, there were those who asked, would the sun truly falter without so much blood? Or was this hunger the hunger of priests and rulers, dressed in the poetry of flowers? Yet the drums still called, and the warriors still came. They came in the cool mist of morning, when the volcanoes stood like guardians in the east. They came in the shimmering heat of midday, when the dust rose from the plain in pale veils. They came in the shadowed evenings, when the air turned cold, and the fires of the city began to burn like fallen stars. And in each season they fought and captured and offered, as their fathers had done and their fathers before them. The climax of these rites was not the battle, but the day after. In the great plaza, the captives would be brought forward, clothed in bright garments, feathers woven into their hair, the scent of copal incense curling around them. The crowd would watch in silence as they climbed the temple steps, the sun blazing at their backs. At the summit, they would be laid upon the stone altar. The obsidian blade, sharp as night itself, would flash once. The heart, still trembling with life, would be lifted high toward the sky, a final flower given to the sun. The body would tumble down the temple steps, but the heart was carried to the sanctuary, to be placed before the image of Huitzilopochtli, who wore a crown of hummingbird feathers and bore the weapon of fire. The people would feast and sing, for the sun had been fed, and life would go on. Time, however, is a patient conqueror. The Spanish came with steel and fire, and the flower wars withered under their shadow. The drums grew silent. The fields where warriors once danced their deadly ballet fell to seed and dust. The gods who had demanded so many blooms were cast down, their temples torn apart, their names whispered only in secret. Yet something lingers in the old songs still sung in quiet corners, in the painted codices hidden in archives. The memory of the flower wars remains. It is a memory heavy with contradiction, cruelty, and beauty twined together, faith and fear bound in the same knot. a memory of a people who sought to hold back the night with the only currency they believed the sun would take, the beating heart of a human being. And so we are left to ponder, was it devotion that led them to the field, or duty? Was it love for the sun, or fear of its absence? Perhaps both, braided so tightly that they could not be pulled apart. We, who no longer offer hearts to the sky, still know the impulse to give something precious, something irreplaceable, in the hope that light will return. The lake beds have dried, the feathers have rotted away, but somewhere, in the long hush, before dawn, if you listen closely, you might still hear the faint echo of a conch shell, calling warriors to a field where flowers once bloomed in the language of blood. They called it chocolate, but no sweetness lived within it. It came in small, brown bricks, wrapped in waxed paper and stamped with the name Hershey. Yet the soldiers who tore it open under rain-smeared skies or in the choking dust of battlefields knew better. This was not a confection to be sipped, was a survival tool, a riddle of nourishment disguised as a treat. The military had asked for a miracle, a bar that would not melt in a desert sun, would not crumble in a pocket, would fill a man's stomach and keep him standing. But there was one final, deliberate request: make it so unpleasant that no one would eat it unless desperation left them no choice. The year was 1941, when the US Army approached Hershey's. Europe was already burning. Across the Atlantic, soldiers fought through forests and ruins, through cities reduced to ash, and the need for portable rations grew urgent. Field kitchens could not keep pace with the movement of war. The answer, it seemed, was to compress sustenance into something a man could carry in his packlight, enough not to weigh him down, strong enough to withstand the baking steel of a tank's interior. But in the logic of war, there was a strange fear. If the ration was too delicious, soldiers might eat it at leisure instead of saving it for when all other food was gone. And so the D-ration bar was born in secrecy. In the Hershey factory, under the hum of machinery, men and women stirred vats of cocoa powder, oat flour, sugar, and a dense web of vitamins and minerals. They tempered it not for smoothness, but for fortitude. The result was something so dense that a soldier was instructed to nibble it slowly, chewing might break a tooth. In the summer heat of North Africa, it could sit for hours in the breast pocket of a uniform and emerge unchanged. In the freezing winters of the Ardennes, it could be eaten like a block of frozen earth. When the bars reached the front, soldiers unwrapped them with the curiosity of those expecting a small comfort from home. They imagined the sweetness of milk, chocolate, the brief illusion of childhood candy stores. Instead, they were met with a taste described by one infantryman as a sweetened brick of sand. Some tried to soften it over a flame. Others mixed it into boiling water, hoping to coax it into hot cocoa. Most learnt quickly to keep it as currency, trading the brown slabs for cigarettes, or for any scrap of bread or canned meat. The direct had done its job too well. It was edible only in the way bark is edible. Soldiers would carry it through mud, snow, and ruin, knowing it was there as a last defense against hunger, but praying they would not need to eat it, yet it persisted. In foxholes, men clutched them in the dark, feeling their weight like a talisman. In parachute drops behind enemy lines, the bar was a guarantee that, for at least a day, a man could keep moving. There were whispers among the ranks that this was Hitler's true secret weapon, not tanks or bombers, but the grim resolve to keep fighting after a D-ration meal. Some men claimed it slowed their bodies, left their stomachs clenched and hollow. Others swore they had marched through days of cold on nothing but those stubborn bars. In the arithmetic of survival, It was a strange bargain, energy without joy, sustenance without soul. By 1943, Hershey's had been asked to refine the recipe, not to make it sweeter, but to adapt it for the tropical theaters of war, where heat would warp and melt even the Duration's iron will. Thus was born the tropical bar, another indestructible block, nearly identical in taste, but capable of surviving the jungles of the Pacific. In photographs, G is in sweat-soaked uniforms, grin for the camera, holding the bars like small trophies. The smiles hide the truth. They would have traded 3 of them for a single slice of pie in the mud of Normandy. In the jungle humidity of Guadalcanal, in the snow-laced air of Bastogne, the bars endured alongside the men who carried them. They became part of the quiet weight of war, as constant as the rattle of canteens and the press of boots on frozen ground. A soldier might forget the name of a village he had fought through, but not the bitter, chalky taste that lingered after a bite of the Duration. When the war ended, and the soldiers returned home, Hershey's resumed its place as a purveyor of sweetness. The D-ration was retired, replaced by bars that melted easily, broke softly, tasted of comfort rather than necessity. But for those who had eaten the wartime bars, there was an unspoken understanding that chocolate could be more than pleasure. It could be a weapon of endurance, a silent companion in the darkest hours. Some veterans kept an old D-ration in a drawer or a foot locker, long past the point where it could be eaten. They would take it out sometimes, turn it over in their hands, feeling the weight that had once been more than food. It was the weight of survival itself, a reminder of the days when every small thing carried into the field had to justify its place. The bitterness of the bar was the bitterness of war, sustaining, but never sweet. Even now, in quiet museums, you can find one still wrapped, still unyielding after decades. If you hold it, you feel not the smooth promise of dessert, but the hardness of something forged for endurance. And if you bite it, though few do, you taste what the soldiers tasted in the winter of 44, in the jungles of 42. It is the taste of a moment when survival was the only luxury, and every other comfort was a memory. In the end, perhaps that was the truest purpose of the D-ration, not to feed the body, but to remind the man carrying it that his comfort was not the point. That in war, every sweetness is rationed, every pleasure postponed, and that sometimes the things that keep you alive do not feel like salvation at all. It lingers, that thought, long after the bar is gone, long after the war has ended. We live, we endure on things that do not nourish the soul, and in the quiet after the battle, we learn to crave sweetness again, but somewhere deep we remember the taste of survival. It is hard, it is bitter, and it never quite leaves you. They say the year began with a strange stillness in the air, as if the earth itself held its breath. The rivers ran slow beneath a lid of ice. The forests stood black and bare against the pale winter sky. And in the villages of Prussia, the wind carried only the thin cries of crows. It was 1414, and already whispers spoke of a war that would not roar with the clash of steel, but creep in the quiet. Seeping into the soil like poison, they called it the Hunger War. It began not with the blare of trumpets or the rolling of siege engines, but with smoke thin and black at first, then swelling into columns that smeared the horizon. The Polish-Lithuanian armies had come, but not to seize castles or batter gates. They marched across the land with torches and blades, not to kill men, but to cut the very throat of the earth. They felled orchards heavy with promise. They trampled the seedbeds. They set fire to barns where summer's labor slept in sheaves of golden grain. They salted the furrows so that nothing green would rise again. From the first, it was understood that this was no war for honor. It was a war of attrition, a slow killing. The Teutonic knights, proud in their white mantles marked with black crosses, could defend their fortresses. But what good are walls when the fields outside them turned to ash? Spring came, but it was a false spring. In the charred countryside, the wind carried the scent of soot instead of blossom. The villagers lay stripped, their thatched roofs collapsed, their wells choked with dirt. Cattle wandered thin and mad-eyed, gnawing at fence posts for lack of pasture. And in the cities, bread shrank to hard black crusts, doled out like relics. The hunger moved quickly, quicker than any army. It seeped under gates and through shutters. It hollowed the cheeks of children and dulled the eyes of soldiers. In the monasteries, the friars prayed over shrinking loaves and measured out their cellars with trembling hands. In the years accounting, 86 friars would perish, holy men undone not by sword or pike, but by the slow gnawing from within. In the countryside, the peasants fared worse. Many fled into the woods, hoping to find wild berries, hares, or roots to keep them alive. But even the forests felt the hand of war. Soldiers had driven game away, and the undergrowth was picked clean. Plague came soon after, borne on the backs of rats that grew bold in the empty barns. Hunger weakens the body, and sickness follows hunger like a shadow. Entire households vanished in days, their huts left open to the wind. The bells told less for battle than for burial, and yet, for all its cruelty, the war had no clear victor. The Polish Lithuanian forces had meant to break the Teutonic knights, but the famine they unleashed spared no one, not even their own. Crops failed on both sides of the border. The land lay sick and silent, a body bleeding from wounds inflicted by its own hands. Those who lived through that year remembered not battles, but moments. The first time they saw a neighbor's hearth cold in midwinter. The day they realized the seed grain had been eaten. The sight of a mother weeping over a child too weak to cry. It was said that in the high towers of the knights' castles, the lords argued over terms, over territory, over pride. But no treaty came to soothe the hunger. Armies withdrew, not because they were defeated, but because there was nothing left to take. The fields stood bare for seasons afterward, as if the earth had not forgiven the insult. And when the rains came, they brought not abundance, but the strange, sickly green of weeds that thrive where grain will not. What remains of that year is not a song of victory, nor a story of conquest. It is a caution, whispered in the furrows of old fields, that war fought against the earth is war against oneself. For what triumph can there be in starving your enemy? If you too must kneel before the same empty table, what legacy is left when the land itself turns its face away, refusing to feed you? And in the quiet, after the armies had gone, after the last fires burned low, a silence fell over Prussia so deep it seemed to swallow the sound of human footsteps. In that silence, the earth began its slow, secret work of healing, but it never forgot. The people remembered, too, not in banners hung or battles recited, but in the wary way they watched the horizon each autumn, measuring the harvest against the shadow of that year. And perhaps they knew then what we still struggle to learn, that a war against the seed is a war without end, and that famine, once called, is a guest that does not easily leave. The hunger war was not written in the annals as the bloodiest or the longest, but, for those who endured it, it was the most intimate. It entered their homes, their bodies, their dreams, and in the quiet graveyards, where the stones still lean toward the setting sun, the wind that moves through the tall grass, carries the same question it carried 600 years ago. Can a war be victorious if it destroys its own seed? The answer lies not in the chronicles of kings, but in the barren ground, in the ghost of an orchard that will never bloom again, in the silence between heartbeats, when the table is empty and the sky offers no promise. And so the year 1414 passed into memory, leaving behind not the glory of conquest, but the taste of hunger, dry, bitter, unforgettable. They say it began in silence. A silence so small you might have missed it just the absence of 3 voices that once clucked in the dawn. No bugle call, no clash of armor. Only the stillness of a farmyard in the chill before sunrise, where the air smelled of wood smoke and frost, and a man's breath came in plumes as he stood, staring at an empty coop. 3 hens, gone. The only wealth a poor family could carry in their arms. But in the Dauphin of Iwu Barling, nothing was ever just what it seemed. Here, in the green folds of the foothills, beneath the shadow of proud lords and ancient stone keeps, a theft was never only a theft. Each act carried the weight of pride, of insult, of the invisible chains that bound peasant to noble, noble to crown. 3 hens might be meat for a week, but in the wrong mouth they were an open wound. The lord of this land was not a man to bear slights lightly. His coat of arms, stitched in gold, carried the memory of battles long past, and he saw every misstep of his tenants as a challenge to his dignity. When the complaint reached his whole cold stone underfoot, firelight flickering across his fur-trimmed cloak, he did not hear of hunger or poverty or a farmer's grief. He heard of insult. He heard defiance. The air that winter was thin and brittle, the kind that cracks in the hands. Snow clung stubbornly to the slopes, but in the valleys the frost bit at tender shoots, warning of a lean harvest to come. It should have been a time for forbearance, for turning quarrels aside and guarding what little would feed the mouths of spring. Instead, the Lord summoned his men, a small band, no more than a dozen spears in their hands, mail under their winter cloaks, sent to the village where the hens had been taken. What happened there was not war, not at first. The soldiers arrived like a shadow before the dawn, their boots crunching over hard ground. They searched, they questioned, they threatened. They found nothing but fear, and fear is a dangerous currency in any land. A man perhaps guilty, perhaps only unlucky, spoke too quickly or too slow, and a blow was struck. Another followed, shouts rose. By the time the sun reached the ridge, the snow in the lane was stamped down and stained. The villagers, stung, did not wait to mourn. Pride has a way of binding men faster than grief. In the next days, they called upon neighbors, cousins, friends from the next valley over. Pitchforks were pulled from haylofts, hunting bows from rafters. Men who had not ridden to war in 20 years saddled their mules and came. It was no army, only a swarm of anger, yet anger feeds itself more swiftly than bread. The first true clash came at the edge of a frozen field. On one side, the Lord's men disciplined, armored, their breath misting through their visors. On the other, villagers with leather jerkins and rough hands, their faces red with cold and fury. The hens were never spoken of. They had already been plucked, roasted, and eaten weeks before. Now it was about honor, about not bending the knee, about the memory of a fist raised in a neighbor's face. It lasted minutes. Steel and wood met with hollow thuds, and the air filled with the startled cries of men unaccustomed to killing. A few fell, more fled. But the snow was marked now, the line crossed. and once a feud tastes blood, it rarely stops hungering. Winter deepened. Raids came in the night, storehouses broken open, sheep driven away in the darkness. A mill was burned on the riverbank, its wheel charred and still. The flour within turned to grey ash. Men died for less than bread that year, cut down in skirmishes where neither side could remember what words began the fight. The frost on the fields grew thick and stayed late, and the wheat that might have grown came up thin. Yellow, starved by spring, the slopes of the Dauphin were scarred in ways that no green could hide. Roofs sagged where fire had found them, ditches filled with runoff from trampled earth. In the village where the hens had vanished, children learned to sleep lightly, to listen for the sound of boots on the road. The nobleman's pride was unbent, the peasant's anger unbroken, but the granaries stood hollow. That summer, they say, the air was heavy with the smell of unwashed clothes and empty kitchens. Even the rivers seemed sluggish, as though carrying the weight of what had passed. Those who survived worked the soil with hands calloused twice over, planting in land that no longer trusted men. When the fighting finally ebbed, it was not because peace had been made, but because there was nothing left worth taking. The hens were gone. The stores were gone. The will to lift a weapon was gone. No treaty was written, no apology given. The only monument to the war was the silence that settled over the valley, broken only by the wind in the thatch and the occasional creak of an empty coupe door swinging open in the breeze. Years later, when strangers passed through and asked about the barren harvests of 80, the elders would tell it simply. It was the War of the Three Hens. And though the words might be met with laughter from outsiders, the eyes of those who had lived it would grow distant, remembering the winter when pride outweighed hunger, when men spilled blood for something already eaten, when fields lay fallow, under snow and the coops stood empty, and in that stillness one wonders how many wars are truly fought for justice, and how many for the vanity of men. How many coops must stand empty before we learn that some hungers are never worth feeding? It began, they say, with laughter. Not the gentle laughter of friends warmed by wine, but the brittle, sharp-edged kind that cuts through the air like glass. In the winter of 1328, the great hall of Vianden was alive with the crackle of fire and the murmur of noble tongues. The stone walls sweated from the heat of torches. Shadows quivered on carved beams as servants poured jugs of dark red wine, the fragrance of roasted venison and cloves curling through the rafters. It was a night of feasting, a night when words should have been wrapped in velvet and pride left. Slumbering, yet pride is a restless creature. Baron Henry of Bettendorf sat near the hearth, his broad shoulders wrapped in a cloak of wolf fur, his goblet heavy with burgundy. He was a man of careful grooming, each strand of his golden beard combed and perfumed, its ends tied with tiny silver clasps. Across the table, Baron Gerard of S., whose family's lands lay along the Alzette, leaned in with flushed cheeks and a restless smile. His beard, dark as wet soil and curling untamed, caught the firelight like tangled brambles in autumn. The insult, when it came, was not shouted. It was not even uttered with open malice. It was said with the kind of mockery that hides behind a smile, a passing remark about the woods nesting in one's whiskers. The hall froze in a breathless pause. Henry's laughter died first. His hand tightened on the goblet, knuckles pale, wine trembling at the rim. No man in that room failed to see the change in his eyes, how the warmth went out of them, replaced by something colder than the stone beneath their feet. In another place, at another time, such a jest might have been swallowed, washed down with drink, and forgotten by dawn. But in Luxembourg of that age, when honour was a brittle crown worn too tightly, no man could bear to be shamed in his own hall. The next morning Gerard's men found their way barred on the road home by riders in Henry's colours. The clash was swift, steel ringing in the frosted air, and though no man was slain, the message was clear. The beard had become a banner of war. What began as an insult over whiskers grew like ivy over stone, twisting into every shadowed corner. Of politics and blood feud, banners were stitched, squires sharpened pikes until the edges gleamed like ice. Old grudges, long kept quiet, were pulled from the dark and set before the fire dot by spring. The hills north of Luxembourg were restless, with the tramp of armoured boots. Raids flickered across the land like lightning villagers burned for their allegiance. Bridges pulled down into rivers, cattle driven away in the night. Each side took captives not to ransom, but to shave, dragging noblemen into the market square, and shearing their beards to the root while the crowd jeered. For a knight of that century, it was humiliation deeper than the cut of any sword. The chronicles tell little of strategy or great battles. They speak, instead of torchlight winding through the forests, of smoke drifting low across valleys where lambs bleated in fear. They tell of wives watching from doorways as men marched away with faces grim, knowing some would return bloodied, others not at all. One night, when the moon was thin as a scythe, Henry's men crept into the heart of Esse's domain. They scaled the orchard walls, muffling the crunch of frost beneath their boots, and burst into the manor like wolves through a fold. Gerard was away, but his steward was dragged from bed, his beard hacked off before the hearth, while the attackers drank his wine. The embers of the fire glowed red against the silver on their blades. It could have ended there, many thought it would, but pride, once roused, does not lie down easily. Gerard answered with a siege on Bettendorf's smallest stronghold, a squat stone tower guarding the road to the Moselle. For 3 weeks, arrows rattled against the parapets like dry rain. The defenders, their beards still intact, shouted insults down from the walls, comparing Gerard's men to mules, to sheep, to eunuchs. When the tower fell, its garrison was not slaughtered. Instead, Gerard ordered each man bound to a post in the courtyard. A barber was brought from the village, his hands trembling, and one by one, the captives' beards were scraped away until their faces shone like pale moons in the torchlight. The laughter that night carried far into the dark. It is said that by midsummer, no field lay untrampled, no river untainted with the silt of burned timbers. Even the monasteries were not spared. Monks spoke of armed men storming their refectories, demanding to know whether the brothers favoured a groomed beard or a wild one. The brothers, caught between oaths and survival, gave blessings to both sides, their prayers mingling with the scent of smoke from nearby villages. In time, the war devoured itself. Men grew tired of sleeping in armour, of eating bread blackened with ash. Families watched their stores of grain dwindle. The price of salt rose until even the wealthy began to taste the bite of hunger. Small victories meant nothing. No land had changed hands. No honour had been restored. The hills were quiet again. But in that quiet was an emptiness, the kind left by a fire that has burned out, leaving only blackened stones and a smell that will not fade. The end did not come with a treaty, or a grand meeting in the hall of some neutral lord. It came in silence, one raid left unanswered, one insult left without reply. Like a candle guttering in the wind, the war of the whiskers died because no one had breath left to keep it alight. The last act, remembered only in whispers, was cruel. In the autumn after the fighting ceased, Henry and Gerard were invited to a feast in Luxembourg City by a duke weary of their feud. The hall was lit with 100 candles, their flames trembling in the draught. There was music and the smell of roasted boar, and for a time it seemed the old laughter had returned. But when the wine had run deep and the hour was late, servants brought forth a pair of silver mirrors and placed them before the two barons. While they stared, puzzled, the duke's own barber stepped forward, razor in hand. It is said the duke himself smiled and spoke words now lost to time, but whatever he said, both men submitted, and in the flicker of those candles, the last beards of the war were shaven clean. They left the hall with bare chins, the wind biting at skin that had not felt it in years. No chronicler tells us if they spoke to each other that night. Perhaps they walked apart in the moonlight, their footsteps echoing on the cobbled streets, each man tasting the strange lightness of his own face. Today, there is little to mark the war of the whiskers. A few lines in the archives, a smudge of ink on the margins of a monk's chronicle, a folk song sung in jest at harvest fairs. The land they fought over still rolls green under the sun, and the rivers still wind their patient way through the valleys. But if you walk the old roads on a winter night, some swear you can hear the faint sound of laughter, sharp and cold, like the first crack in a sheet of ice. And perhaps that is the only truth worth keeping, that pride, once wounded, can burn, hotter than gold, higher than banners, and far longer than any flame has a right to burn. For swords grow dull, and walls crumble, and even beards will grow again. But an insult has teeth. It began with the scent of sugar drifting through the hot breath of Mexico City. Not the warm sweetness of a festival stool, but a ghost of sweetness, faint and stubborn, carried on air thick with dust and horse sweat. They say it came from a little shop on the kale detachable whitewashed walls, a green-painted door, and inside, marble counters crowded with sugared fruits and glazed tarts that gleamed like jewels under the lamplight. Years before the war, when the city was still, young in its independence, the Frenchman had come one of many who drifted across oceans chasing fortune. He brought with him not soldiers, nor merchants' gold, but butter, flour, copper pots, and the secret alchemy of Parisian pastry. His hands could fold dough so thin the sun shone through it, could spin sugar into glass. Mexicans of wealth came to taste the delicate millefeuille, the tiny cakes scented with orange blossom, and then one night the soldiers came. They were not French. They were Mexican officers drunk, laughing, the smell of aguardiente heavy on their breath. They wanted drink, not pastry. When told there was none, they wanted money. When told there was none, they wanted sport. What happened in that narrow shop on Calle de Tacuba was never recorded in full, but by dawn the counters were overturned, the sugared fruit smashed, the ovens cold. The Frenchman's livelihood lay in shards and crumbs upon the floor. The city forgot. He did not. For 10 years he nursed that grievance, like dough left to rise in the dark. He wrote letters, demanded justice, and received only silence. But he was not the only Frenchman in Mexico with tales of insult and loss. There were others. Merchants cheated, warehouses plundered in the turbulence of a young republic. Their complaints gathered in the chancelleries of Paris, stacked like loaves awaiting the oven. And then, in 1838, the oven was lit. France sent a demand 600,000 pesos in reparation, a sum so swollen it was more than Mexico's treasury could spill without bleeding. The French king, Louis Philippe, set the grievance of one pastry chef alongside the debts of merchants and demanded them all paid. The government in Mexico scoffed. The streets of Mexico City were boiling with their own unrest, their own hungers. Who would pay a king in Paris for a tart gone stale a decade ago? The French answered not with words, but with sails. In the chill of November, the horizon of the Gulf darkened with the shadows of warships. Tall masts cut across the pale dawn. The tricolor snapped in the salt wind. At Veracruz, fishermen looked up from their nets to see the steel glint of cannon muzzles peering from wooden holes. The blockade began as quietly as a noose tightening. Nothing entered, nothing left. The markets thinned. The price of bread rose. Merchants grumbled behind shuttered doors. In the city's cantinas, the story twisted. Some said the war was for gold, others for a single man's pastries. But the truth, whatever it was, tasted bitter. Then came the bombardment at dawn. The French guns opened on San Juan de Ulloa, the great fort guarding Veracruz. The air split with the roar of iron. Smoke rolled low across the water, choking the gulls. From the sky, the fort's cannons answered, their boom echoing against the stone houses along the shore. But the French fire was relentless, a steady hammer against old walls. Salt spray mingled with the black grit of powder. Inside Veracruz, women clutched children and pressed themselves into doorways as the ground shook. Men hurried through streets with pails of water, knowing they could not quench flame when it fell from the sky. The sea smelled of salt and sulphur, and somewhere under it all, as some swore in years after, a faint perfume of scorched sugar, like the ghost of that little shop, baked into the smoke. The siege lasted months. Scurvy and fever gnawed at the Mexican garrison. The blockade strangled the ports, silencing the clamor of trade. Yet Mexico would not yield, not to the insult of a foreign king's demand, not to the roar of ships from across the Atlantic. Pride held as stubbornly as hunger, and so Britain came. The British merchants had their own ships idling in Caribbean waters, their own fortunes snarled by the blockade. They had no taste for French cannons dominating the Gulf. Through their diplomats came the soft knock of mediation, the quiet words spoken in candlelit rooms. By March of 1839, the guns cooled, the sails loosened, the blockade lifted. Mexico agreed to pay the demanded sum, though the silver would trickle slowly, like syrup grudgingly poured. The French ships drifted away over the horizon, their holds no richer than when they came, their pride intact. The city of Veracruz was left with shattered walls and blackened timbers, with the stink of powder in the air. The name of the pastry chef, the spark of all this, slipped away into the dust. His shop had long since vanished, swallowed by the churn of the city. No one could say if he ever returned to France, or if he walked the streets of Mexico City in his old age, tasting bitterness at every sweet he passed. Yet the tale clung, as tales do, not in ledgers or treaties, but in the murmur of markets. Old men would tell it under the shade of an arcade, how a war once rose for a tart, how cannon roared for a confection. They told it with a smile, but in their eyes was the knowing that wars are rarely about what they seem. If you walk the port of Veracruz in the still heat of noon, when the gulls circle lazily above the reef and the water laps against the old stones, you may catch at the mingled scent of brine and something else, something faint and sweet. Some say it is only the bakeries inland, their ovens spilling into the wind. Others say it is older, a ghost smell of sugar and gunpowder, baked into the bones of the port. for grievances, once baked, can outlast the men who tasted them. They can be carried across oceans, loaded into cannon, set ablaze over cities that never knew the flavor of the quarrel. They rise, they swell, they harden into something that can crack teeth and spill blood. And when they fall silent at last, there is no sweetness left, only the silence, and the faint smell of something burning far away. It began with the sound of steel biting wood, a ringing, splintering cry that echoed off the hills above the bay of islands. In the half-light of dawn, when the sea lay still and the gulls had not yet stirred, the tall flagstaff at Cororarica leaned, shuddered, and fell. It was not the first time. The pole had stood high above the little town, rising from the earth like a spear, bearing the Union Jack into the wind. To the British settlers, it was a proud signal, a mark of governance, a tether to the distant island from which they had come. But to Hone Heka, Rangatira of Gunpoy, it was a wound driven into the soil, constant reminder of the treaty signed, and of the slow erosion of Mbori sovereignty that followed. Heka had once been a friend to the British, a man who traded, who listened, who weighed the new world with a careful hand. But trade had shifted, fortunes had drained from Mbori harbours, and laws written in a tongue not his own began to root in the land. The flagstaff became a symboler, slender, wooden, tyrant that cast a shadow longer than its height. So he cut it down, the first time the British rebuilt it. Taller, thicker, with iron bindings at its base to defy the axe. The second time it rose again, each plank planed smooth, as though the wood itself could forget its fall. The third time it stood once more, crowned with the same flag that fluttered in the sea wind, and each time, before long, Hicks warriors came in the early light, and the pole crashed down again, the fabric dragged into the dust. It was more than timber being felled. It was pride. It was a challenge by the fourth cutting. The British could not laugh it off. Warships loomed in the harbour, their black hulls mirrored in the glassy water, their decks bristling with cannon. Soldiers were stationed in Cororarica, redcoats blazing against the green slopes. The Union Jack was raised higher still, nailed into the wind as though daring it to be struck. The summer of 1845 was bright in the Bay of Islands. The sea shimmered like molten silver. The air smelled of manuka and salt. Yet in the shade of the forests, men gathered Mbori warriors with muskets slung and tomahawks at their belts, their hair bound back, their faces marked with moko that told the stories of their blood. They moved like shadows through the bush, silent but for the hiss of grass underfoot. Heka did not come alone. Alongside him was Koiti, another chief of Genpai, older, wary, and fierce. Their plans wound through the hills like the hidden streams that fed the Bakewiat until they broke into the open. On the morning of March 11th, the tide was low. A haze lay over the water, muffling the colours of the town from the ridges above. Cororarica, the warriors descended, not toward the flagstaff, but toward the heart of the settlement. Muskets cracked, the smoke curling into the still air. The defenders, British soldiers and settler volunteers, rushed to meet them. The sharp bark of gunfire mingling with the deeper thunder of the warship Hazard's guns from the harbour. The fight surged through the narrow streets. Powder stung the air. The cries of wounded men mingled with the shouts in English and Terio Mbori. In the chaos, Hicks' men slipped to the hill where the flagstaff stood. The axe rang again. The great pole shuddered, groaned, and fell once more, its crown of cloth tumbling into the grass dot below. The town was burning. Flames climbed the walls of wooden houses, sending black columns into the sky. Women and children fled to the shore, scrambling into small boats that pushed toward the anchored ships. From the decks, sailors hauled them aboard, the sea slapping against the hull as the town cracked and roared behind them. By nightfall, Cororedica was ash, the Union Jack was gone, and the war had begun in earnest. It did not end in days, nor in weeks. The fight spread across the north, through forests dense with fern and over ridges where the wind keened like a morning flute. Ambori, fortified strongholds of timber and trench rows like teeth from the earth. The British, unused to their design, found them stubborn to breach. Muskets spat from palisades, warriors slipping through underground shelters as cannonballs thudded harmlessly into earth. Heka and Kawiti struck and vanished, drawing the redcoats deep into the green labyrinth of the land. Every advance was paid, for in blood every hill held only so long as the British could bear the silence of the bush around them. The Union Jack was raised where it could be, but always with the knowledge that somewhere in the shadows the axe might be waiting. Months wore on. Both sides bled. There were no great, decisive battles, only the slow grind of raids, skirmishes, and sieges. The war ended not with surrender, but with an understanding too fragile to call peace. Heka lived on in his own lands, the British still in theirs. The flagstaff left to the wind, in time, a new pole was raised at Cororedica, but never again in the same place, never again so proud against the hill. The old site remained bare, the grass whispering over the spot where the timber once stood. Some say the bay is cursed now, that on certain dawns, if the air is still, you can hear the crack of an axe and the slow, hollow fall of wood. Others say that it's only the sound of the wind in the gullies or the surf breaking against the headland. But those who remember know the truth that the fight was never about a flag, nor a staff, nor even a town reduced to cinders. It was about the unseen weight of dignity, the invisible cord that binds a people to their land, to their name, to the right to stand unbowed. You cannot cut such a cord with a treaty, nor bind it with rope, nor nail it to the top of a pole. It will rise again, like a tide, like the shadow of the hills at sunset. And so, when the flag falls, something else always rises, sometimes peace, sometimes war, always defiance. They say it began with glass, thin and cold, cradling a fragment of flesh. A small ear, pale and shrunken, floating in a bath of clear spirits that caught the candlelight like amber. No crown, no flag, no fleet only. This, lifted in a trembling hand before the great chamber of Parliament. It was 1738 when Captain Robert Jenkins stood there, his face drawn by years of wind and salt, his eyes shadowed with the memory of a hot day in distant waters. The jar rested on the table between him and the men who ruled an empire. They leaned forward, their wigs powdered, their eyes searching for outrage, for a reason to ignite the powder kegs waiting in their harbors. The story he told had roots 7 years deep. In April of 1731, the sun hung heavy over the waters near Havana. The Caribbean was a furnace of light and heat, where the sea shimmered like molten metal and the air tasted of brine and rum. Jenkins's brig, the Rebecca, cut through the swells under a sky too blue to promise peace. They came at him out of the glare, a Spanish guarda-costa, its hull dark, its sails like wings folded against the wind. The Spanish captain called for the Rebecca to heave to, his voice sharp and a tongue edged with command. These were waters, Spain claimed, though Britain's merchants sailed them in defiance. Their holds heavy with goods, both lawful and otherwise. The boarding was swift. Boots thudded on the deck. Muskets glinted. The Spanish searched the brig with the precision of men who had done so many times before, but the search soured. Words turned to shouts. A shove, a drawn blade, the ring of steel scraping wood. Then came the blow, an arc of steel flashing in the sun, the sting of iron through flesh. Jenkins reeled, his ear falling from him as if the sea itself had torn it away. The Spanish captain, Juan León Fandiño, is said to have pressed it into his hand and murmured words that would echo in London years later. Go, tell your king that I will do the same to him if he dares the same. The Rebecca limped home. Most wounds fade. This one did not. Jenkins preserved the earsome, say in brandy. Others in rum its pale curve suspended in liquid that kept it from rotting, but could not keep it from becoming something else entirely, a symbol. 7 years passed. The world turned. Empires shifted pieces across the oceans like kings moving pawns on a board. And yet, when Britain sought a spark to set the Spanish tinder alight, the jar was lifted into the air once more. In Parliament, the air was thick with words, treaties broken, merchants wronged, insults too deep to ignore. But it was the ear that settled the matter. It was small enough to fit in the palm, yet vast enough to open the gates of war. The fleet sailed in the autumn of 1739. The War of Jenkins' Ear, as it would be called in whispers and later in ink, spread first to the Caribbean, where the heat was a living thing and disease rode every breath of wind. British ships fanned out from Jamaica, their decks creaking under the weight of cannon and the hunger for reprisal. The first great strike was at Portobello, on the Spanish Main. In the dark before dawn, the British guns thundered, their fire painting the sea with flickers of red. The fortifications crumbled under the iron rain, and the town fell quickly. Bells rang in London when the news arrived. They said the insult had been answered. But the war was not finished with them in Cartagena. The Spaniards stood behind walls that seemed to grow from the earth itself, thick and ancient, washed by centuries of tides. In 1741, Admiral Edward Vernon came with nearly 200 ships, the sea so crowded with masts that the horizon became a forest. 40,000 men, British and colonial troops, gathered under the relentless sun. The assault began with hope, but hope rots quickly. In the tropics, fever took the camps first, yellow eyes staring up from the hammocks of the dying. The heat melted discipline. Mosquitoes drank without fear, and from the walls Spanish guns spoke in steady rhythm, breaking hulls, splintering masts. The attack collapsed. The sea swallowed the dead, the jungle the bones of the sick. The British fleet limped away, the war no closer to ending than before. Years ground on. The fighting bled into a larger conflict, the War of the Austrian Succession, where the ear was forgotten in the smoke of wider battles. Men died in places whose names they had never heard before they stepped ashore. Ports changed hands, only to be taken again. The sea drank its fill of blood and powder. By the time the peace came in 1748, it was as thin and frayed as old sailcloth. The war's prizes were meagre, its cost vast, and the ear, its fate slipped from memory. No record tells if it was buried, discarded, or simply left on some forgotten shelf in the Parliament archives. Its spirit trapped in cloudy liquid until the glass broke, yet the ghost of it lingers. In the quiet corners of maritime museums, in the whisper of rigging in a night harbor. You can almost imagine it still turning slowly in its jar, catching the dim light. A relic of how fragile peace can be. For peace does not always shatter. Under cannon fire or the march of armies, sometimes it cracks along the thin edge of an insult, along the curve of an ear severed in the glare of a Caribbean sun. From that crack the sea rushes in, carrying ships and men into years of ruin, and so the question remains, unanswered by all the treaties, since when one man's wound can open an ocean, how long before the next jar is lifted? They say it was not made by human hands. Long before the white sails came over the sea, long before the thunder of rifles echoed through the forests, the golden stool descended from the sky. Not a mere chair, but a throne without equal its legs. Short, its seat broad, its surface hammered and worked until it gleamed like sunlight caught in metal. The Ashanti did not place it in a palace hall for comfort, nor set it under the weight of a ruler's body. It was never meant to be sat upon. It was the beating heart of the kingdom, a vessel for the spirit of the people. In its carved hollows, they said, rested the very soul of the Ashanti nation past, present, and yet to come. To touch it without permission was sacrilege. To take it was to wound the land itself. And in the year 1900, that wound was threatened. The forests of Ashanti. Land were deep and green, thick with the breath of the earth. Rain fell like whispers through the leaves, pooling in the hollows of great roots, and the air carried the scent of damp bark and distant fire. The British had been in the region for years, pushing inland, planting their flags and pressing treaties into the hands of chiefs. The gold beneath the soil, the cocoa, the trade routes, all of it tempted the crown's grasp. Yet one thing they had not taken, one thing they had not even seen, was the golden stool. The Ashanti kept it hidden. Wrapped in silk, carried in silence, its location known only to a trusted few. It was not guarded like a treasure of gold, it was guarded like breath itself. When the British governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, arrived in Kumasi, he brought with him the arrogance of a man used to commanding obedience. He called the chiefs to gather in the great hall. The air was heavy that day, and even the torches along the walls seemed to burn lower, their flames wavering as though sensing the words about to be spoken. Hodgson did not speak in the careful, measured way of someone stepping into another's sacred ground. He spoke in the voice of command, his boots planted firmly on the earth, his hands behind his back. "Where is the golden stool?" he demanded. The hall went silent. Chiefs glanced at one another, their eyes dark and unblinking. He spoke again, louder, asking why he, as the representative of the Queen of England, could not sit upon it as the symbol of his authority. Perhaps he thought it a simple seat, a throne like those of European kings. Perhaps he believed that to possess it would seal the Ashanti under British rule forever. But he did not understand that the stool was not his to see nor any outsiders. Among those in the room was a woman whose name the Ashanti would remember, Ya Asantewa, the Queen Mother of Ijesu. She was not young, her hair touched with the silver of age, yet her eyes burned with a sharp, steady fire. That night, in a council of chiefs, she rose to speak. Her voice was quiet at first, yet it carried to the farthest corners of the room. "If you men will not fight," she said, "then we, the women, will. We will fight until the last of us falls in the battlefields. We will fight until the blood of our children runs in the rivers. We will fight for the golden stool, for it is the soul of our people. Without it, we are nothing." Her words were not wind. The next days saw warriors gathering, weapons in hand, their drums speaking across the forests. The British in Kumasi soon found themselves surrounded. Paths were cut off, messengers intercepted, supply lines severed. Muskets cracked in the distance, their echoes running through the trees like warning spirits. The siege began. For weeks, the British garrison was trapped inside the fort. Outside, Ashanti warriors moved like shadows through the undergrowth, striking and vanishing before the enemy could answer. The humid air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and sweat, with the cries of battle carried on the wind. At night, the forest glowed with the faint light of campfires, their smoke curling upward like prayers to ancestors. The golden stool remained hidden. Even as the fighting raged, no British hand so much as brushed its golden surface. But war leaves scars on all it touches. In time, the siege was broken not by surrender of the Ashanti spirit, but by the weight of British reinforcements pushing inland. Villages burned, crops were trampled under the boots of marching columns. The war's end was not a victory in the old sense, but a survival. Ja Asantua herself was captured, exiled far from her homeland. She would never see Ashanti land again, yet the golden stoolant, touched, unbroken, remained in Ashanti keeping. It was never taken, never sat upon by the foreign governor who had demanded it. The British may have claimed the land, the laws, the taxes, but they had not claimed the soul, and in the quiet years that followed, the stool stayed hidden, wrapped in cloth, guarded by those who understood what it meant. It was not just gold, not just a relic of kings. It was the memory of a people who had stood against an empire for something unseen and untouchable. Some say the stool still carries the breath of the ancestors, that to stand before it is to feel the weight of centuries pressing upon your chest. The gold is warm, they whisper, as though lit from within by a flame that will never die. The British built their roads and their railways, their outposts and their stations, but they did not find the heart they sought to claim. And perhaps that is the deeper truth, that there are some things no empire can conquer. In the forest, the rains still fall as they always have. The earth still drinks deeply, and somewhere, far from foreign eyes, the golden stool rests in silence, as it has for generations. The gold does not tarnish, and neither does the memory of those who fought for it. For what is worth more territory that can be mapped and measured, or the unseen soul of a people which no conqueror's hand can hold? Even now, when the night is deep and the rain speaks against the leaves, you might almost hear it, the low, steady hum of something eternal, the voice of a nation carried in a single, shining throne that no one dares to sit upon. It began in a place where the air clung heavy with the scent of wet reeds, and the ground trembled under its own waterlogged weight. The land was not beautiful in the way poets might praise, nor rich with gold or grain. It was a band of marsh, a strip of earth smothered in stagnant pools and swarms of summer mosquitoes. Yet in the restless summer of the 1830s, this narrow sliver, hardly more than a smear on the map, was enough to rouse the pride of two states and stir them toward war. Before it had a name worth repeating in taverns, the Toledo Strip lay half forgotten. Between Michigan Territory and the state of Ohio, a swamp sown with cattails and crossed by sluggish creeks. The dispute began, as so many do, with a line drawn on parchment in a distant hall, inked by men who had never set foot in the muck they were dividing. Their maps were uncertain, their measurements imperfect. A cartographer's flick of the wrist had left two governments convinced the land was theirs. The people in the strip did not live in grandeur. They were farmers with fields that drowned in spring rains, fishermen who cast nets in rivers the color of tea, traders who trudged through mud so deep it sucked at the boots like a living thing. Yet they were not immune to the swell of pride when told their home lay in the heart of a great contest. To them, the boundary was not just a matter of lit, was a question of belonging. In Ohio's capital, voices rose with the confidence of an older state. Ohio had rivers feeding into the great waters of Lake Erie, and they saw Toledo as a jewel in the making, a port that could link their commerce to the heart of the continent. Michigan Territory, younger but fierce, claimed the land by right of survey and the letter of earlier documents. Its leaders argued that if this strip were lost, the young state's pride would be cut before it had even drawn its first breath. That summer, militias gathered. In Michigan, men drilled in dusty fields, muskets gleaming in the heat. In Ohio, the same. Drums beat under wide skies, the sound carrying through the night like distant thunder. Officers paced with sabers at their hips, imagining glory to come. The newspapers fanned the flames, painting each side as a guardian of justice and the other as a thief lurking at the border. The first moves were quiet. Almost timid, sheriffs sent to arrest surveyors from the other side, deputies shadowing strangers in the swamp. The air was tense, as if the cattails themselves were listening for the crack of a musket. Then came the one true wound of this so-called war. A Michigan sheriff, attempting to make an arrest, was stabbed in the leg by an Ohioan's blade. The newspapers called it a daring assault. In truth, it was a small, clumsy act of resistance, the kind born of heat, mud, and too much pride. No grand battle followed. There was no cavalry charge through the marsh, no roar of cannon. Instead, men in uniforms stood in the same damp fields for days, staring across at one another. At night, fires burned low, and the mosquitoes claimed their tribute from both sides without prejudice. The land did not care for the flags planted in its soil. It drank the sweat of both armies equally. The dispute might have stretched on, if not for the distant, cooler hands of Congress. In Washington, the quarrel seemed almost absurd to American. Land squaring off not for a glittering port already humming with trade, but for a swamp still half asleep in its own silence. And yet, the strip was a matter of pride, and pride could not be ignored. When the ruling came, it was like a strange bargain struck by an unseen merchant. The Toledo strip would be given to Ohio. Michigan would be consoled with something unexpected, the vast, wild reaches of the Upper Peninsula. At the time, it was seen as poor, Ponenta, rugged, forested land far from the centers of trade. But the ink was signed, the militias disbanded, and the Toledo War ended without the glory so many had imagined. In the years that followed, the swamp was drained. Canals cut their way through the land. Toledo rose from the marsh with its brick buildings and smokestacks, a city of industry where once had been only the drone of summer insects. Michigan, in time, would find treasure in its northern Giftian copper, forests deep enough to swallow a man whole. Yet the story remains, quiet as a shadow in the archives, told in the flicker of lamplight on rainy nights, how men almost went to war over a place most would not have chosen to keep, had it not been claimed by the other. Pride can make kingdoms bleed. Here, it merely dampened the boots of young soldiers and left a scar on the leg of one unlucky sheriff. And so the strip lies still on the maps, thin as a seam, its fields and streets unaware of the armies once poised to defend it. The marsh is gone, but the lesson lingers like mist above a river at dawn, that in the long memory of land, It is not always beauty or wealth that stirs men to fight. Sometimes it is the simple, stubborn need to hold what is theirs, even if the soil itself seems to wish for nothing at all. The North Atlantic lay like a sheet of hammered pewter beneath the winter sky grey upon grey. Horizon blurred into cloud, the wind a constant, moaning presence. Out here, in waters that froze the marrow and stung the lungs. Men had lived and died for centuries, chasing the silver flash of cod. The fish swam in cold, tight schools, their bodies glinting faintly in the dim green gloom, a living treasure, chest beneath the waves. And in the middle of the 20th century, this treasure scales and salt, not gold or jewels, would set two nations on a collision course. The sea had long been Iceland's larder. From the days of sagas and longships, when the island's first settlers survived on what the cold ocean gave them, fish was more than food. It was life, trade, survival. The smell of drying cod clung to harbour towns like a second skin, its salted flesh stacked in sheds, traded to Europe, feeding far-off cities that would never see these coasts. But by the mid-century, the world's appetite for fish was growing ravenous, and the cod shoals, once so plentiful, began to thin beneath the reach of steel trawlers from other lands. In 1958, the Icelandic government made a proclamation, a line in the sea, invisible but iron in intent. They extended their fishing limit from 4 miles to 12, declaring that foreign trawlers must keep away from the feeding grounds their people had depended on for generations. To the great trawler fleets of Britain, this was not merely a line. It was a wall built overnight across their livelihoods. These fishermen had long steamed into Icelandic waters without thought, filling their holds with catch until the decks were slippery with silver and blood. To be told they could no longer do so was unthinkable. And so, steel answered steel. The Royal Navy sent warships to guard the trawlers. Iceland dispatched small, sturdy patrol boats, nimble as gulls, beside the hulking British frigates armed, not with heavy guns, but with a different weapon entirely: trawl wire cutters. These were iron jaws that could be lowered into the sea, severing the thick cables that dragged a trawler's nets. A single cut could mean tens of thousands of pounds, lost in a day's catch. Out there, far from land, the air reeked of diesel and salt, the sea slick with churned foam. Ships circled and lunged at each other, the patrol boats darting in like wolves, snapping at the flanks of a larger beast. Hulls groaned under the strain of sudden ramming, steel plating shrieking in protest. Men on deck clung to rails as the bows of enemy vessels loomed close enough for the salt spray of impact to sting their faces. There were no cannon salvos, no musket lines only. The raw grinding violence of ship against ship, the deep, dull thud that travelled through the bones of every man aboard in the frozen dark of an Icelandic winter night. The sea could feel like the loneliest battlefield in the world. Searchlights swept across black waves, catching for an instant the ghostly gleam of another hull before it vanished into shadow. The men stood watch in silence, their gloved hands stiff, their breath frosting before them, every nerve tuned to the shudder of engines and the ominous shift of water that meant another vessel was drawing near. The British thought to wear the Icelanders down with sheer mass and presence. But the islanders had the patience of fishermen and the stubbornness of those who have wrestled life from a harsh land. They cut the trawler wires again and again, harrying the fleets until the British were forced to reconsider. Yet the quarrel did not die. In 1972, and again in 1975, Iceland pushed the boundaries further, first to 50 miles, then to 200. Each extension was met with outrage and return of the trawlers under naval guard. The sea became a chessboard of moving steel, where the pieces sometimes collided with bone-jarring force. Patrol boats would slip between two trawlers, their decks alive with crew ready to drop the cutters, while British frigates swung into position to shield their own. Sometimes collisions left holes big enough for daylight to pour into the mess deck. Sometimes men went overboard into the killing cold and had to be hauled back, half frozen, before the sea claimed them. There were moments when tempers threatened to turn the Cold War hot. Radio channels crackled with curses in two languages. There were shouts across decks as men caught glimpses of the same faces again and again in these drawn-out encounters, rivals bound by the same harsh sea. But for all the ramming, the cutting, the brinkmanship, no one was killed in the fighting. In this strange war, the greatest wounds were to pride, to steel, and to the centuries-old understanding of who had the right to fish where. What Britain did not expect was that Iceland, small as it was, would wield more than patrol boats. It threatened to close a NATO base at Keflavik, a keystone in the Cold War map of the North Atlantic. For powers far greater than either fishing fleet, the thought of losing such a foothold was unthinkable. Pressure mounted from all sides, and in the end, diplomacy not gunfire settled what the collisions could not. Iceland kept its claim. The waters out to 200 miles became theirs to guard, their fish to harvest. For the trawlers that once swept these grounds, the loss was bitter. For the islanders, it was a victory measured not in land gained, but in the unseen wealth beneath the waves, in the promise that their children would still find cod in the deep green dot. Now the North Atlantic has grown quieter. The fishing grounds are patrolled, but the great steel duels are gone. The sea rolls on in its endless grey swells, indifferent to the lines men draw across its face. Yet if you listen on a calm day, when the only sound is the slow breathing of the tide, you might almost hear it, the echo of hulls colliding. The snap of a severed cable whipping back through the water, the muffled shouts of men braced against the rail. That it was not a war of empires or of faith, not a war for gold or for glory. It was a war for the smallest scales, for the right to keep one's own table full. And in its strange, bloodless way, it proved that even in a world grown vast and mechanized, there are still battles fought for the oldest reasons of all: hunger, survival, and the deep, enduring bond between a people and the sea that feeds them. The waves remember, though they never tell. They hold the memory of prow against prow, of the bright silver of cod beneath the surface, of two nations circling, in the cold, unwilling to yield. And when the gulls wheel low over the water, their cries thin in the wind, perhaps they too are calling back to that time, a time when the North Atlantic was a battlefield, and the war was not over treasure, but over the living treasure of the sea. It was a hot, airless afternoon when the dust rose like a pale ghost across the plains of Cerro Gordo. The air trembled not from cannon fire, not yet, but from the weight of a moment just before ruin. In that hour the earth seemed to hold its breath, and so did the men. Somewhere between the ragged ridges and the parched thorn-covered ground, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, president and general, clutched the reins of his horse and felt the sting of heat beneath his uniform. He had known the bite of musket balls before, the choking smoke of battle, the taste of both victory and disgrace. But on this day, it would not be the life of his flesh that history remembered, it would be the loss of a thing both less and more than human. He had been riding with his officers, commanding positions, issuing orders that carried the sharp tone of a man who believed himself master of his fate. Yet war is not courteous. It does not knock before entering. It tears through the door, laughing. When the American guns roared from their hidden line, the hillsides seemed to split open. Men fell like wheat before the scythe. Horses screamed, the sound almost human, the air filled with the hiss of lead and the shatter of splintering rock. Santa Anna's bodyguard, loyal and desperate, called for him to withdraw. He turned in the saddle, calculating not in courage or cowardice, but in survival. The next volley came faster than thought, and a hot bloom of pain flared in his left knee, the one that was already gone. Not flesh, but wood. His artificial leg, the polished maple that had carried him through parades and councils, was jarred loose in the chaos. The straps tore, the buckles gave way, and in the rush to save himself, he left it behind. It lay there in the dust carved, absurdly elegant in the ruin around it. A thing once polished for the dignity of a president, now half buried. In grit and shadow, the Americans found it after the smoke had thinned. They lifted it like a relic, a prize more precious in humiliation than in gold. Soldiers laughed as they turned it in their hands, marveling at its craftsmanship, at the fine boot still fitted to its end. Word spread down the line from the ranks. To the officers, they had taken not just a field, but Santa Anna's very leg, and with the cruelty of victors, they understood the power of such a trophy. The leg travelled north, far from the chaparral and the bright, merciless sun. It crossed rivers and plains, its journey quiet but not forgotten, until it reached Illinois. There it was paraded through streets in the company of banners and brass bands, the citizens gaping in wonder at this strange spoil of war. It stood, in glass, a mute monument to a single man's defeat, and yet to something more universal, the stripping of dignity in the eyes of the world. Santa Anna felt the wound deeper than any battlefield injury. He had lost battles before. He had been exiled, returned, and risen again. But this was mockery carved in wood. His pride, his image, the very posture of command had been taken and put on display in a foreign land. In quiet moments, he spoke of the leg with the same heat as one might speak of a brother slain. He vowed not merely to win wars, but to reclaim it. Not for utility he could, and did, commission another, but for honor. Years passed, regimes changed. Santa Anna's fortunes rose and fell like the tide. Yet the wooden leg remained beyond his reach, locked behind glass in a place where the air was cold and the language foreign. The Americans would not return it, for they knew its weight was measured not in oak and leather, but in the sting of memory. And so the general lived on, carried forward on another crafted limb, but never free of the ghost of the one he had lost. Sometimes, in the quiet between campaigns, he would touch the straps of his new leg and feel the echo of the old. There was an emptiness there, not in the flesh, but in the story unfinished. Unanswered, the years after the war softened nothing. The leg in Illinois became a local curiosity, the kind of artifact a father might lift a child to see in the dim light of a county museum. The wood grew dry, the leather cracked, yet it kept its shape, stubborn as its owner had once been. People pointed, smiled, shook their heads at the oddness of it. Few thought of the man who had worn it, of the dust and the gun smoke, of the pride that had burned hotter than the Mexican sun. History often forgets the living weight of humiliation. It flattens it into a footnote, a curiosity. But to Santa Anna, the loss of that leg was more than a quirk of fate. It was a theft of self. His enemies had not only beaten him on the field, they had taken a piece of his myth, and myths are harder to rebuild than nations. In the end, he died without reclaiming it. The leg stayed where it was, unyielding, preserved in the still air of display cases and quiet halls. Generations would pass before travelers from Mexico would stand before it and feel a strange pull mingling of pity, pride, and the faint sting of insult. The wood, for all its silence, spoke in the language of loss. Perhaps it still does, for in the hush of the museum at night, when the lights are dim and the glass reflects only shadow, there is the sense that it waits not to be worn again, but to be understood. Wars end, treaties are signed, borders drawn. But pride is a war without an armistice. It fights on in the dark corners of the heart, in the relics we cannot bear to forget, and sometimes the heaviest burden a man carries is not made of flesh or bone at all, but of carved wood, polished once, then left to gather the slow, endless dust of memory.